In the far north, where nights were long and winters dark, the Vikings lived in harmony with nature. They fought bravely on sea and land, but when evening fell, they laid down their weapons. That was the time for rest. Sleep was no mystery to them, no struggle. It came naturally like the falling of snow or the rising of the summer Sunday. Their days were full, with work, hunting, forging, or sailing. Their bodies were tired, their minds clear. And when the evening air turned cold and the stars appeared above the land, the whole body knew it is time to sleep. The longhouses grew quiet after sunset. Only the soft crackling of the fire and the sound of breathing filled the space. There was no light except from the flames. No sound but the wind outside, or the distant howl of a wolf. They slept in rhythm with the earth. In winter, when darkness lasted almost the whole day, they slept long. In summer, when the light barely faded, their sleep was shorter but still deep. They followed the seasons without resistance. Waking during the night was normal. In those quiet hours, they did not stir with impatience. They might sit by the fire, pray to the gods, whisper stories, or reflect on dreams. Then, without worry, they returned to their beds, and the night carried them back to sleep, 2 calm stretches with peace in between. There was no pressure to rest, no need to do it right. Sleep was like breathing part of life. They didn't learn it, they lived it. Nature set the rhythm. Darkness brought rest. Fire gave warmth and safety. There was no fear of night, no chasing after sleep. Only surrender to the silence. And when the first pale light reached the edge of the longhouse, they rose, calm, rested, ready to hunt, to build, to fight, or to tell stories. Not because they had mastered sleep, but because they had respected it. The Vikings, known for their strength and courage, also knew the art of rest. Not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Not as something to earn, but as something granted to them each day. This is how they slept beneath the stars, guided by fire and silence, rocked by the breath of the land. It's hard to imagine today, waking in the middle of the night and not feeling panic. No glowing screen, no urgent sense of failure, just quiet. Stillness. Firelight flickering against wooden beams. A low breath of wind outside. And within that silence, not fear or frustration, but comfort, intention, time. This was the world of the Viking night. Step inside a Norse longhouse. It's winter. The sun has set hours ago, and it won't rise again until late morning. A family sleeps together, nestled on raised platforms along the walls. The hearth at the centre glows softly, more embers than flame now, banked for warmth, not light. The air smells faintly of wood smoke, wool, and earth. Someone stirs. Not from restlessness, but because it's time. This is the moment between the first and second sleep. A pause, a breath. In Viking times, this interval wasn't strange. It was expected, natural. A space for quiet talk, checking on animals, tending the fire, sipping water or ale, praying, whispering stories. Then, with no sense of failure or urgency, sleep returned. For centuries, this segmented sleep pattern, 2 restful periods with a wakeful interlude, was the human norm. It appears not only in Norse sagas, but in medieval medical texts, diaries, and even court records across Europe. And while modern people might call that night waking a disorder, the truth is more complex. The people of Viking times weren't broken. They were sleeping exactly as their bodies were designed to. They lived by the sky. Their days began with first light and ended with last. Their meals were timed, not by clocks, but by hunger and sunlight. Their evenings were filled with slow, winding rituals: food, fire, stories, silence. There were no urgent pings, no emails to check, no bright bulbs burning long past dark. In that space, sleep didn't need to be chased, it simply came. And when it came, it did more than restore. It healed, it strengthened. It prepared warriors for battle, farmers for long days, mothers for care. It supported minds that remembered vast oral histories and bodies that endured Arctic cold. And though they knew nothing of REM cycles or melatonin, the Vikings created through habit and necessity sleep environments that modern science now calls ideal. So what changed? We did. We severed the link between body and nature. We lit up the night and blurred the day. We made sleep a deadline, a measurement, a thing to win or lose. But the people of Viking times, they kept the thread unbroken. Their secret wasn't some ancient potion or divine gift. It was the structure of their days, the honesty of their nights, and the way they listened to their own tiredness without trying to control it. To understand Viking sleep is to understand a life we've forgotten, but not one we can't learn from. The clues are there, waiting, not in new technology, but in the old rhythms we once knew by heart. What if the way we sleep today, rigid, linear, 8 hours straight in one go, isn't natural at all? What if the standard we chase night after night was never meant to be a standard in the first place? The people of Viking times didn't lie awake, wondering why they couldn't sleep through the night. They didn't see midnight waking as a flaw. They lived by a rhythm that modern science is only just beginning to understand: segmented sleep. Long before the industrial clock tower rang out its demands, before artificial light broke the night into pieces, humans slept in two distinct phases. First sleep, a pause. Second sleep. It was so common that it had names in many old languages: Old English, French, Latin, and yes, Old Norse. In sagas and folk tales, you'll find it quiet references to waking between sleeps, to stirring in the dark without fear or judgment. The Vikings didn't just know this pattern, they lived it. Sleep came shortly after darkness fell. In northern winters, that could be as early as mid-afternoon. A few hours of rest, then waking calm, clear-headed, even creative. This wasn't a time of restlessness or worry. It was a time for presence. To tend the hearth, whisper with a spouse, tell a tale, pray, think, breathe. Then, sometime later, a return to bed for the second sleep, deeper than the first. It may sound radical, but it isn't. This is how human bodies are wired: a natural dip in alertness after dusk, a brief, peaceful wakefulness after the first sleep cycle, and then the second descent, longer, deeper, richer. Modern researchers were stunned when they began uncovering this pattern. A historian named A. Roger Akirch combed through hundreds of historical documents and found reference after reference to segmented sleep across cultures and continents. He didn't invent a theory, he uncovered a truth that had been quietly erased by modernity. And what caused that erasure? The moment we filled the night with light, we lost the pause. Candles, gas lamps, and eventually the electric bulb pushed back the dark and stretched our days into our nights. Waking at midnight was no longer a gentle interlude, it became a problem, a diagnosis, and so we forgot. But the Vikings never had to remember. For them, it was simply life. Their homes, their rhythms, their relationship with the sun and firelight all allowed them to rest the way humans had rested for millennia. Their sleep wasn't consolidated, but it was complete. They didn't count hours, they followed time, the way a river follows the land. In this forgotten rhythm, lies a powerful truth. The best sleep isn't always straight through. It flows, pauses, returns. And in the darkness of a Viking night, without knowing it, they mastered what we are only now trying to reclaim. In the heart of every Viking longhouse, there was a fire. Not a roaring blaze, but a steady, glowing presence, warm, flickering, alive. It was more than a source of heat. It was the pulse of the home. The hearth fire held the darkness at bay, but never banished it. It did not blaze like the harsh light of a modern bulb. It breathed low and slow, casting amber light and long shadows against the wooden beams. And in that glow, Viking sleep unfolded. The hearth fire was constant, tended carefully throughout the night. Its light was warm red and low on the spectrum, nothing like the cold blue glare of screens that now bathe modern bedrooms. Today, sleep researchers know what the Vikings never needed to learn in a lab. That this kind of light, soft and fireborne, protects melatonin production, preserving the body's ability to know night from day. In Viking times, the fire gave just enough light to move through the dark, to wake gently, to speak in hushed voices without jolting the brain back into wakefulness. The fire was also a guardian. In winter, its warmth kept frost from creeping over sleepers' limbs. In dangerous times, its light marked the centre of the household, a signal of life to those within and a warning to those without. It was both sanctuary and symbol of continuity, of presence, of the living night. When first sleep ended, it was often the hearth that drew someone from the platform. They might place a few more pieces of wood onto the coals, stir the embers, sit in silence, eyes adjusting to the low flicker. This was not insomnia, it was ritual, and the hearth fire made it possible. Imagine a Viking mother rising in the middle of the night to check on a child. No harsh lights to snap her from sleep. No digital clocks to remind her of what time she should be sleeping. Just the firelight and the quiet. She could tend to her task and return to rest, her body still holding the rhythm of the night. Even in waking, the atmosphere remained sleep's ally. Everything in that space, the warmth, the silence, the soft rustle of wool and fur, invited rest. There was no battle between night and day. No conflict between work and rest. The fire did not intrude, it accompanied. Today, we fill our nights with light that argues with the dark, light that stimulates, interrupts, demands. But the Vikings knew a different kind of illumination, one that danced quietly with shadow, that gave just enough and asked for nothing. In the glow of the hearth fire, sleep wasn't something to chase. It was something that arrived, naturally, faithfully, like the slow breath of the coals beneath the stone. In that flickering warmth, the secret to perfect sleep was never hidden. It was simply there. The Vikings left behind no sleep manuals, no scientific treatises, or flowcharts of ideal rest. But they left stories epic, tangled, sometimes brutal stories woven into sagas, passed from mouth to mouth, memory to memory, and eventually page to page. And within those stories, if you listen closely, you'll hear sleep. Not as an inconvenience, not as a weakness, but as something understood, respected, and rhythmically lived. In the old Norse sagas, sleep is a backdrop, a setting, a rhythm underlying the action. A hero wakes after his first sleep to tend to his animals. A woman rises in the quiet middle hours to whisper with her husband before returning to bed. These are not dramatic moments, they're ordinary. So ordinary, in fact, that they barely draw attention except to a modern eye, starved of context and convinced that waking at midnight must mean something is wrong. The sagas use terms like Förstasveffen, first sleep, and Annasveffen, second sleep. These references are subtle but consistent. They reveal a pattern of life where the night was not a single, solid block, but something porous, something lived in layers. The Norse people expected the night to come in phases, and they made room for it not with panic, but with presence. This middle waking wasn't restless tossing. It was a time for still tasks, soft words, the kind of quiet connection the modern world has almost forgotten. One saga tells of a chieftain who discusses plans with his kin between sleeps. Another speaks of lovers sharing words in the dark hours, just after waking and just before sleep takes them again. It was a time for closeness, for reflection, for care. What these stories show is not just that bifurcated sleep existed, but that it was normalized, ingrained into the structure of everyday life. No one questioned waking at midnight. It was not an error. It was a rhythm like breathing. And these weren't isolated examples. Throughout medieval Europe, similar patterns appear in records, diaries, and literature. But in the Viking world, surrounded by cold, ruled by cycles of sun and shadow, the pattern was perhaps most deeply felt. The sagas, with their blunt language and larger-than-life characters, offer us glimpses into a culture that never questioned what modernity forgot. Today, we treat midnight waking as a failure, a disorder, something to fix with pills or screens. But the people of Viking times knew something we've lost, that sleep, like life, is not always linear. Sometimes the best rest comes not in 8 unbroken hours, but in 2 quiet halves, stitched together by firelight, conversation, and peace. In the sagas, we don't find a prescription. We find permission to slow down, to listen, to wake without fear, to sleep again when the body is ready. And in that quiet acceptance, perhaps, lies the beginning of rediscovering what they never had to learn because they never forgot. For centuries, the Viking way of sleeping passed quietly through time unchanged. For centuries, the Viking way of sleeping passed quietly through time unchanged, unexamined, and eventually forgotten. But in recent decades, science has started to circle back to something older, something quieter, something the people of Viking times understood, not through research, but through instinct, that the way we sleep today may not be the way we were designed to. Across sleep labs and clinics worldwide, researchers are uncovering an unsettling truth. Modern sleep is not natural. It's disrupted, manipulated, and often misaligned with our biology. Artificial lights extend our waking hours well past sunset. Blue-lit screens overstimulate our brains late into the night. Stress and overwork spike cortisol levels, suppressing melatonin, the hormone responsible for sleep. And worst of all, we evaluate our rest by how long we're unconscious, not by how restored we feel in the morning. Then came a breakthrough that surprised even seasoned researchers. In a landmark study, participants were removed from all artificial lighting and allowed to live solely by natural light-dark cycles. Within just a few days, a surprising sleep pattern emerged. They began to sleep in 2 distinct phases. First, sleep, a period of quiet wakefulness. Then, second sleep, the very rhythm described in medieval texts, echoed in ancient cultures, and likely lived by the Vikings in their longhouses. Melatonin began rising earlier in the evening. Sleep became deeper, more restorative. The period of wakefulness between sleep cycles was calm, not anxious or restless, but peaceful. For many participants, it felt familiar, like something their bodies had been waiting to return to. Science now calls this pattern biphasic, or bifurcated sleep. But for the Vikings, it was simply normal. In another study, people exposed to red spectrum lighting before bed, similar to the glow of firelight, produced significantly more melatonin than those exposed to blue spectrum light, the kind emitted by modern devices. This discovery sheds new light on an old habit. The Viking hearth fire didn't just warm the home, it supported the body's natural sleep chemistry. Even their physical environment was ideal for sleep. The absence of artificial light, the cool temperatures of northern nights, and bedding made of natural materials like straw and wool. Today, we try to mimic this with blackout curtains, temperature-controlled mattresses, and white noise machines. But for the Vikings, these weren't sleep hacks, they were simply life. Viking life wasn't engineered for rest. It didn't need to be. It allowed sleep to happen as nature intended, free of technology, unburdened by time pressures, and in rhythm with the world outside. Now, science is finally catching up to what the past always knew. In our quest for better sleep, we're slowly rediscovering what the Vikings never forgot. In the softness of firelight, the stillness of night, and the acceptance of waking in the dark, they had what we now chase. Sleep that heals, restores, and prepares us for the day ahead. They didn't track it. They didn't measure it. But by every standard, they slept better than we do. And maybe the strongest proof is this. When we remove the noise, the glare, the artificial demands, our bodies begin to sleep like theirs once did. Because deep down, we never really forgot. The fire is low, the longhouse is quiet. Outside, the sky is deep black, pierced only by the faint shimmer of stars. It is the middle of the night, but not a time of dread or sleepless frustration. In a Viking home, this hour is expected, welcomed even. The first sleep has ended, and now begins the waking. This pause between sleeps was not a disruption. It was a moment, a space for life to breathe in the silence. After rising from the warmth of the sleeping platform, someone might stir the fire, add a few branches, and sit near the coals, their face lit by the orange glow. There is no hurry, no guilt, just a presence in the stillness. Some might speak softly with those nearby about the next day's work, about the livestock, about dreams. Others might step outside, wrapping furs against the cold, to check on animals or simply gaze at the sky. The northern air was crisp and clear. The world was asleep, but not entirely. There was space to move, space to think, space to simply be. Children might roll over and drift deeper into their second sleep, while a parent sits awake by the fire. An elder might rise to pray. A young couple might speak quietly under a shared fur, this moment between sleeps, a rare intimacy in a crowded household. This wasn't insomnia. It wasn't a problem. It was known, expected, and even built into the night. The sagas speak of such moments, with ease characters rising in the dark, performing tasks, whispering plans, making love, praying, watching. Then, as naturally as waking, they return to rest. In modern terms, this might seem like lost sleep, but to the people of Viking times, it was complete. First sleep restored the body. The waking moment settled the mind. Second, sleep brought depth and calm, and it worked not because they designed it that way, but because it was the rhythm life gave them. Today, when we wake at night, we panic. We think something is wrong. We reach for our phones. We calculate how many hours are left before morning. We fill the silence with anxiety. But what if we didn't? What if, like the Vikings, we saw that time not as lost, but as part of the night's unfolding? In that dark interlude, there is an ancient peace we've forgotten. The Vikings didn't need advice, columns, or apps to tell them how to handle night waking. They simply lived it. And they returned to sleep, not with frustration, but with ease. Perhaps the secret to perfect sleep isn't staying unconscious for 8 hours. Perhaps it's letting night stretch out warm, dark, quiet, and accepting its rhythm. Just as they did, long ago, beneath the wooden beams and glowing hearth of a Norse longhouse, Bjorn rose from his straw bedding with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who'd done this 100 times before. The air inside the longhouse was cold but not biting. He wrapped his wool cloak tighter around his shoulders and padded barefoot across the earthen floor, careful not to step on the small form of his youngest son curled beneath a fur pelt. The hearth still breathed a soft red glow beneath the dark ash. Bjorn knelt and stirred it gently with an iron rod, feeding in 2 small pieces of birchwood. The flame responded like a living thing, flaring into a soft amber light that flickered across the rafters. Around him, the rest of the household slept in deep silence. But this moment, this hour between sleeps, belonged to him. He didn't rush. There was no urgency. This time had always been his. As a boy, he had watched his father use it to sharpen tools. As a young man, he had used it to carve runes, to think, to plan the next day's trade routes. Now, in his middle years, he used it for stillness. Tonight, he moved to the back of the longhouse, where the goats slept in their little pen, separated from the main room by a low wooden partition. One of them had been restless at dusk. He'd noticed her limping slightly on the rear leg. Quietly, he checked her now, whispering a low hum so she wouldn't startle. She looked at him, blinked slowly, and returned to chewing her cud. The limp was gone. He smiled. Returning to the hearth, he sat on a small stool carved from pine. He poured a little warm ale from a clay jar into a wooden cup and stared into the flame. Thoughts came, unhurried, of the field that needed draining, of the fishing line that needed retying, but there was no rush. No list, just presence. The longhouse breathed with him. Then, almost like a tide drawing back to sea, sleep began to return. His shoulders sagged, the cup now empty in his hand. He stirred the coals one last time, ensuring they would burn low but steady. Then he rose, walked back to the platform where his family lay in sleep, and settled beneath the fir once more. Within minutes, he had drifted into second sleep. This was no special night. There was no feast, no battle, no storm. It was ordinary. But in that ordinary moment, where silence met thought and task met stillness, Bjorn lived out a pattern that would one day be forgotten. To him, it was just the way nights worked. He didn't know that centuries later, his simple rhythm would be seen as something extraordinary, that his calm hour at the hearth would be called a secret to perfect sleep. But it was, and he lived it every night. In the world of the Vikings, darkness wasn't something to escape. It was something to live within. It came early in the winter months and stayed long into the morning. It wrapped itself around their homes and their routines, not as an enemy, but as a guide, a signal that it was time to slow down, to be still, to rest. Today, we treat darkness as something unnatural. We chase it away with bulbs, screens, headlights, and glowing cities that pulse through the night. But for most of human history, including the Viking Age, darkness was sacred. And in that darkness, the body knew exactly what to do. In the absence of artificial light, melatonin, the hormone that tells the brain it's time to sleep, rises naturally. And in Viking times, nothing interfered. There were no LEDs humming in the corner of a bedroom, no sudden alerts flashing through the night. When the fire dimmed and the stars overhead began to shimmer, the body understood. It was time to rest. True darkness isn't just about light or the lack of it. It's about safety. It's about quiet. It's about the sense that the world has paused. And in the longhouses of Viking Scandinavia, darkness was thick and complete. No slivers of streetlights through windows, no glow from charging devices, just the slow breathing of sleepers, the whisper of the wind, the soft hiss of the hearth. This complete darkness didn't just allow for better sleep, it demanded it. The human body responds to dark not only with sleep, but with deeper, more restorative stages of sleep. The kind that repairs muscles, strengthens memory, recalibrates emotions. And the Vikings, without meaning to, built their world around this. The very structure of their homes reinforced it. With no glass windows and only a single smoke vent near the roof, the longhouse would be nearly pitch black once the fire dimmed. Thick thatch or turf roofing insulated not only against the cold, but against light. And the result? A sleeping environment that today's sleep scientists try to replicate with blackout curtains, sleep masks, and light-blocking window films. We pay for what they lived. And even outside, under the open sky, Viking darkness was pure. No light pollution dulled the stars. No neon bled across the horizon. When the sun fell, the night came fully, and with it, rest. It's no coincidence that those who live far from artificial light, deep in nature, often report deeper, more dream-filled sleep. It's not because of the quiet alone. It's because of the dark, true dark. The kind the Vikings knew every single night. Their bodies listened, their minds slowed, their sleep deepened. And we, for all our modern comforts, have forgotten what it feels like to sleep in a world that turns off when the sun goes down. But the people of Viking times remembered. They lived by it. And in that darkness, they found not fear, but peace. When the sun vanished beneath the horizon and the northern sky turned to ink, it was the hearth fire that remained. In every Viking longhouse, it was the centre not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, and practically. Around it, meals were shared, children were warmed, tools were mended, stories were told, and when it came to sleep, the hearth held a kind of quiet authority. Its flame was never wild. It was tended, shaped just enough to glow, to warm, to offer the gentlest light to those resting nearby. And that light, though dim, was deeply powerful. Today, scientists know that exposure to light in the blue spectrum, like from LED bulbs, screens, and fluorescents, suppresses melatonin, keeping the brain alert and wired long past dusk. But the reddish light of fire? It does not interrupt sleep. In fact, it encourages it. Without knowing any of this, the Vikings were bathing in the best possible light for sleep every night. The fire didn't dominate the longhouse. It didn't flood it with brightness. Instead, it cast slow-moving shadows, illuminating faces softly, letting the rest of the room fade into a gentle darkness. It whispered to the body, "Relax, you're safe, you're home." In the deep hours between first and second sleep, someone would always stir. It might be a mother rising to check a child, a man tending to an ailing animal, or simply an elder keeping the fire from dying. This was a communal rhythm, subtle, instinctive. The fire was a companion, not a spotlight. It gave the night shape without destroying its depth. Even the crackling sound of the fire worked in harmony with sleep. Its soft, unpredictable rhythm mirrored the sounds of nature, a familiar comfort to the Viking ear. Unlike the mechanical hum of modern devices, the fire was alive. And in its presence, people drifted off, not with stress, but with trust. The hearth also symbolized more than warmth. It was the soul of the home. In Norse belief, the hearth was sacred. It connected the living to the ancestors, the present to the past. It offered more than heat, it offered meaning. And sleep came easier when one felt held by something greater than themselves. Today, we light our rooms with devices that chase away the night, believing that brightness brings productivity, control, comfort. But the people of Viking times found their rest in the glow of something older, something slower. The hearthfire didn't try to make night into day. It honoured night for what it was, a time to turn inward, to be still, to restore. And so, night after night, the Vikings slept beside the fire, not in defiance of the dark, but in companionship with it. And in that warm, flickering glow, they found a kind of sleep we've nearly forgotten. Not just restful, not just deep, safe, sacred, whole. In the modern world, sleep has become a private act, isolated, compartmentalized, shielded behind closed doors and individual rooms. Silence is prized, distance is expected. And yet, for most of human history, including in the time of the Vikings, sleep was not a solitary endeavour. It was shared, it was social. And in that togetherness, something remarkable happened. Inside a Viking longhouse, no one slept alone. Families, servants, elders, children, everyone lay within the same large room, their platforms lining the walls, bodies curled beneath fur and wool. At the centre, the fire offered warmth, but the true heat came from bodies resting side by side, sharing space and breath. In the harsh Nordic winters, this closeness wasn't just convenient, it was essential. But beyond warmth, sleeping together offered something deeper, safety. In a world without locks or electricity, where wild animals roamed the forests and raids were not unheard of, there was comfort in proximity. If danger approached, someone would stir, a mother would hear it. A dog would growl. A warrior would wake. You weren't alone in the dark, you were part of something living, breathing, aware. This unspoken vigilance allowed others to sleep more deeply, more confidently, knowing the night was being held by many, not one. There was a rhythm to it all. The sounds of others, the soft shifting of bodies, the sighs, the quiet snores weren't disruptions. They were signals of life. In our age of hyper-controlled, hyper-quiet bedrooms, we forget that sleep evolved in the presence of others, that the human brain was wired to rest surrounded by the sounds of the tribe, and that complete silence, for our ancestors, might have felt more like danger than peace. Children felt this most of all. Nestled between parents or tucked against older siblings, they slept with a sense of belonging. Not monitored by baby monitors from another room, not trained to self-soothe in isolation, but held within the heartbeat of the household. That closeness regulated them not just emotionally, but physiologically. Breath aligned with breath. Calm settled in by example. Even for adults, there was something profoundly grounding about communal sleep. A quiet conversation between spouses under the furs, a reassuring glance from across the room, a shared ritual of preparing the bedding together at the end of a long day. These small moments, woven into the fabric of each night, reminded every person, you are not alone. Today, we see sleep as something individual, something private, but the Vikings saw it as part of the community, part of the home. In the shared quiet, in the shared warmth, they found a kind of rest we rarely touch. It wasn't just about how long they slept or how deep. It was about how connected they felt while doing it. In that closeness, in that simple human nearness, lay one of the quietest, most powerful secrets to perfect sleep. A secret that breathed beneath the same roof every single night. In the Viking world, Sleep was not just rest, it was trust. A trust in the walls around you, in the people beside you, and in the rhythm of the night itself. And it was this trust, this felt sense of safety, that allowed sleep to sink deep, unbroken, restorative, true. There were no deadbolts in a Viking longhouse. No motion sensors, no alarm systems humming in the background. Protection came not from gadgets, but from closeness, from the living, breathing presence of the group. In those long winter nights, the very structure of their home became a defence and a comfort. The longhouse was built low and long, a fortress of timber and turf. It creaked with the cold and whispered with the wind, but it stood strong. And inside, sleep came not from shutting out the world, but from being held within it. Someone was always listening, not by command, but by instinct. In a household of 10, 12, 15 people, some adult, some elder, some child, someone was always half awake. The rhythm of bifurcated sleep made this even more natural. As one stirred from first sleep, another might still be deep in their second. It created a silent watch, an unspoken rotation, a net that caught every sound before it became threat. A goat shifting too often in its pen, a soft knock of wind that wasn't wind, a dog's ears lifting in the dark. These were the sounds the Vikings knew how to hear. They didn't jolt awake with panic. They listened. They knew. And this ever-present awareness created an atmosphere of calm. Knowing someone else might rise before you did, knowing your partner or your neighbour might hear the same thing you did and rise to check it first. In that subtle social net, danger didn't feel sharp. It felt shared. And because fear was shared, it softened. And because it softened, people slept. Even the architecture played its part. Livestock often shared the longhouse during cold seasons, their heat helping to warm the space. But more than that, their presence gave away the stillness or disturbance of the night. If the animals were quiet, so too could the people be. If they stirred, it meant something. The Vikings watched them, listened to them, folded them into their nightly awareness. There's a reason we sleep lighter when we feel exposed. The modern mind wakes at creaks and groans because we've grown used to sleeping alone. But in Viking times, that lightness of sleep was spread out across the room. Not everyone had to be alert, just someone. And that someone changed, naturally, gently, throughout the night. This unspoken vigilance paired with warmth, firelight, and closeness meant that when sleep came, it came fully, because there was no need to brace, no need to keep one ear open. Others were already listening. The village was already holding you. And in that shared safety, the Vikings slept like few of us ever do. Completely, unguarded, and deeply at peace. There were no memory foam mattresses in the Viking Age. No adjustable bases, no cooling gel, no sleep labs telling people which position was best. And yet, the Vikings slept well, cradled by materials drawn directly from the world around them, straw, wool, fur. Rough, by modern standards perhaps, but simple, honest, and in many ways, perfect. Their bedding began with straw, clean, dry, golden stalks gathered after the harvest and packed into linen sacks or spread directly atop wooden platforms. Straw wasn't soft in the way we think of softness, but it yielded under the body, distributing weight, offering structure. It breathed, it insulated, and when it was worn or flattened, it was easily replaced. On top of the straw lay woolen blankets thick, hand-woven, heavy with lanolin. Wool held warmth like few other materials can. It adapted to the sleeper, keeping them warm in winter and cool in summer. And it was natural, untreated, unprocessed, still carrying the scent of the sheep and the land. To the Viking nose, it was the smell of home. And then came the furs, pelts from bear, deer, or sheep-lined sleeping platforms, layered over bodies like a second skin. They weren't for luxury, they were for survival. But they also brought a sensory comfort that modern beds rarely match. The soft bristle of fur against skin, the weight of it grounding the body, the way it silenced the cold. Together, these elements created a sleep surface that was not uniform but responsive. It creaked and rustled. It shifted. It adapted to each person and each night. And that very imperfection helped the body settle. Not everything was smooth and padded and engineered. It felt lived in, real. Today, many sleep specialists are rediscovering what the Vikings simply accepted: that firmer, more natural surfaces support better spinal alignment, that heavy bedding calms the nervous system, that breathable materials regulate temperature more effectively than synthetic ones. In short, our ancestors weren't behind. In some ways, they were ahead. They didn't need ergonomic charts. They listened to their bodies. Sleeping in the Viking world wasn't about indulgence. It was about comfort earned through relationship with the land, with the animals that gave their wool and skin, with the cycle of use and renewal. A bed was not a product. It was part of the home's ecosystem. There was also ritual to it, spreading out fresh straw, shaking out the wool, laying down pelts. It was part of the day's closing slow, rhythmic grounding. A signal to the body. You've worked, you've eaten, you've sat by the fire. Now, rest. And rest they did not in sterile silence or perfect stillness, but in the soft creak of wood, the rustle of fur, the breath of those beside them. The Viking bed was humble, yes, but it was whole. And in it, sleep came not from luxury, but from alignment with nature, with body, with the earth itself. In the Viking world, sleep was never static. It changed with the sky. It moved with the seasons. The same people who thrived in long sunless winters also adjusted effortlessly to bright, endless summer nights, not through resistance, but through adaptation. Their bodies, like their land, knew how to shift. In winter, darkness ruled. The sun might rise late and fall again before the day felt fully underway. Nights stretched on for 16, sometimes 18 hours. But the Vikings didn't fill that darkness with artificial brightness. They let it guide them. Sleep came earlier. First sleep began not long after dusk. There was more time for rest, for reflection, for quiet. The longhouse became a cocoon. The hearth fire burned steadily, furs were piled high, and people stayed close. Winter was not a time of urgency, it was a time of gathering, conserving, storing strength for the seasons ahead. The long dark hours were not something to endure, they were embraced. Come summer, everything changed. The sun barely dipped below the horizon. Twilight lingered through midnight, and the Vikings adjusted again. They slept less, rose earlier, stayed active longer. Their bodies, shaped by centuries of survival in the north, knew how to flex with the light. But they still protected their rest. Sleeping chambers, or platforms, were sometimes moved farther from the hearth during warmer months, away from heat, closer to fresh air. Openings in the longhouse might be uncovered to let in a cool breeze. Furs were folded back, and woolen layers exchanged for linen. The rhythm of the day, more physical labour, more light, meant sleep. When it came, was earned and immediate. They didn't cling to one model of sleep year-round. They responded to nature's rhythm, and that responsiveness gave them something modern life often denies resilience. Today, our schedules are fixed. We rise at 6 a.m., whether it's January or July. Our jobs don't shift with the Sunday, our lighting doesn't dim with the season. And so we push against our biology instead of moving with it. The Vikings didn't have that problem. They didn't need blackout curtains or sunrise alarms. They simply slept when their bodies told them to, and their bodies listened to the land. Even their architecture reflected this. Roofs were steeply pitched to let snow slide off, but thick enough to hold warmth in. Doorways were narrow to block wind, but positioned to capture evening light in summer. Every part of the longhouse spoke the language of the seasons. And so did their sleep. There's a quiet brilliance in this, the way they didn't fight the changing light, but shaped their lives around it. Not every night was the same, not every sleep was equal, but across the turning year they found balance. Rest in winter, motion in summer. A deep rhythm carried not by clocks, but by time itself. And in that rhythm, they didn't just survive the seasons. They thrived in them. In Viking times, medicine was not a science written in books. It was a knowledge carried in hands, passed through generations, whispered over boiling pots, and gathered beneath full moons. The people turned to the land for healing, and when it came to sleep, they had allies in the soil, in the roots, in the leaves that curled beneath the frost. The herb women healers, midwives, wise folk, knew the language of plants. They were the keepers of old memory, and their knowledge of sleep was deep, practical, and earned. They didn't speak in dosages or molecular structures, but they knew what soothed and what stirred, what calmed a restless body, and what quieted a mind still haunted by the day. Valerian root, with its earthy, bitter smell, was one such remedy. Dried, steeped, or mashed into a paste, it dulled tension and brought the body down slowly, like a boat settling on still water. Chamomile, though not native to Scandinavia, was traded and treasured when available, used to steep a calming tea, a gentle lullaby for the stomach and nerves. But more common were native herbs, meadowsweet, mugwort, yarrow, and hops. Vikings brewed with hops not only for taste and preservation, but for their sedative properties. A strong ale, properly made and taken in the right measure, could quiet the muscles and carry a warrior into sleep as surely as any ritual. Mugwort held a special place in the herbal world. A dream herb, they called it. Tucked under pillows or burned as a smudge, it was believed to bring vivid dreams, visions, sometimes messages. Whether it truly influenced the dreamscape or simply made sleep feel more sacred didn't matter. It worked. And in a culture that valued dreams, saw them as signs, as omens, this mattered deeply. The herb women weren't just healers of the body. They were guardians of sleep. They crafted pillows filled with calming herbs, sachets to be worn around the neck, teas taken just after first sleep to encourage deeper second rest. And they didn't only treat the sick. They helped the well stay that way. Sleep was never treated as a symptom. It was seen as a foundation. If someone couldn't sleep, something in their balance had gone astray. It could be grief, hunger, guilt, cold, a curse, or simply too much change in the wind. The healer would see the person, not the condition, and the remedy would be part plant, part ritual, part story. Modern science now validates many of the herbs Viking healers used, but the real power wasn't in the plant alone, it was in the intention, in the slowing down, in the belief that sleep could be aided, supported, and honoured, not forced, not engineered. In the flickering shadow of the longhouse hearth, a woman might sip a bitter brew, her body loosening after a hard day. not drugged, not sedated, just returned. And sleep, old and wise, would take her gently into the dark. In the Viking mind, dreams were never just dreams. They were messages, signs, glimpses beyond the veil of ordinary life. A dream could be a warning, a blessing, a prophecy, sometimes a visit. And so, sleep was not only for rest, it was for revelation. They called it drama dreams that spoke. These weren't vague flickers of the subconscious to be dismissed in the morning. They were treated with respect, sometimes even fear. A warrior might dream of a battle not yet fought. A mother might see a relative long gone, standing silently by the fire. A chieftain might wake from a vision and change course the next day. Vikings believed that dreams came from the gods, from the ancestors, or from the fylgja, the spirit guide that followed each person. A strong dream could not be ignored. It had meaning, even if it wasn't yet understood. And so when they woke in the middle of the night, between first and second sleep, they didn't just turn over and forget. They remembered, recounted, sometimes shared. This was the time for storytelling, not the kind performed around a fire for a crowd, but the intimate kind, whispered between two people in the dark. I dreamt of the white elk again. There was fire on the water. My brother stood beside me, but he had no shadow. These words were not idle thoughts. They were taken seriously. Sleep was not a pause from life. It was a realm within it. Even the sagas, with all their heroism and history, contain dream scenes that shift the course of everything. In one, a woman dreams of a river of blood before a slaughter. In another, a man sees his own death clearly and accepts it. These stories weren't just tales. They reflected the lived beliefs of a people who knew that sleep was not only a biological need, but a spiritual bridge. Modern science offers theories about dreams, REM cycles, emotional processing, random neural activity, and those may all be true. But what science cannot yet measure is what the Vikings understood intuitively, that sleep carries more than rest. It carries meaning, and to ignore that meaning is to lose part of what sleep is for. In Viking homes, dreams were not dismissed, they were honoured, sometimes interpreted by a wise woman or the vulva, a seeress who understood the hidden layers beneath the surface. At other times, they were simply remembered, written in the quiet of the mind, left to unfold in their own time. Today, we wake from dreams and reach for a screen. We forget them in minutes. But in Viking times, a dream might shape a voyage, a battle, a marriage. And so people slept not just to recover, but to listen. In that deep, ancient quiet, the pause between one world and the next, they found visions. And in those visions, they found direction. Not every night, not every sleeper, but often enough to believe. And belief, as the Vikings knew, is a powerful way to fall asleep. There is something sacred about the night before a battle, a silence that wraps around everything, heavy and expectant. In Viking times, that night was not spent in fear, but in preparation not just of weapons and armour, but of the body, the mind, and yes, of sleep. A warrior's rest wasn't optional, it was ritual. Before a raid or defence, before a voyage that might end in storm or sword, the Norsemen understood that the body needed to be ready, not just in strength, but in stillness. The village would slow. Food would be shared, words would be few, and sleep would be sought not as luxury, but as a tool. They called it while rest, and it was part of the rhythm of war. In the longhouse, the warriors might lie side by side, their shields stacked near the door, their swords within reach. The fire would burn lower than usual, the mood would not be festive. It would be focused, quiet. If anyone spoke, it was in hushed tones, prayers to the gods, reminders of the plan, blessings over the young. Some men would sleep deeply, their exhaustion pulling them into the earth like stone. Others would drift in and out, hovering between wakefulness and dream, listening to the wind outside, the breathing of those beside them. But sleep came, because it had to. The Viking warrior was not just muscle and blood. He was discipline. A man who knew that the sharpest sword was dull in a tired hand, that a slow reaction meant death, that the mind, clouded by fatigue, could betray you faster than any enemy. And so, on the eve of battle, sleep was respected. The body was fueled by good food, thick stews, hard bread, mead or ale in measured amounts. The fire was banked, the bedding arranged, the room kept still. Sleep would not come from fear or from desperation. It would come from ritual, from readiness. Even in the sagas, the greatest warriors are often shown sleeping before the fight. Calm, sure, not because they lacked fear, but because they honoured rest. A warrior who sleeps is not weak, he is wise. And the Vikings knew this well. Today, modern soldiers and athletes are trained to understand the value of pre-performance sleep. Sleep before combat improves reflexes, judgment, focus. But this isn't new. The Vikings lived it, night after night, battle after battle. They didn't need science to tell them that sleep sharpens the edge. So when the horns sounded at dawn, and the boots met earth, and the blades were drawn, they were ready. Not just because they were strong, not just because they were trained, but because they had rested, deeply, intentionally, and in the dark silence of the longhouse, they had found the strength not just to fight, but to survive. That was the warrior's sleep, and it was part of the secret. The Vikings were a people in motion. Farmers, yes. Builders, yes. But also seafarers, traders, raiders, explorers. They set sail toward distant shores long before most of the world believed it possible. And with every journey came the need for a different kind of rest, the sleep of the traveller. Imagine the deck of a longship cutting through frigid northern waters. The wind is sharp, salt crusts your lips. The rowing is rhythmic, endless, your hands blistered, your body soaked. There are no beds, no fire, no silence, but there is still sleep, because it had to be found, even in motion. On long voyages, the Vikings slept when they could, curled beneath rough cloaks, propped against barrels, lying flat in the hull between shifts. They did not demand perfect conditions. They did not need darkness or stillness or quiet. They had trained their bodies to rest in hardship. Sleep became a survival skill, learned through experience, trusted like a blade. A sailor might catch moments of sleep between storms, wrapped in wool and huddled beside others for warmth. He learned to listen to the water, to know by the creak of the wood whether danger was near. But still, when the waves permitted, when the sky held, he would close his eyes. It wasn't deep, uninterrupted rest, but it was enough. On land, when travelling over forests or frozen plains, the Vikings built temporary camps, simple shelters of wood and hide, fires ringed with stones. And here, sleep returned to something more familiar. They would share furs, arrange watches, heat stones for warmth, and slip into rest that was brief but powerful. What modern people might call discomfort, they called life. Sleep, even on the move, was not about perfection, It was about permission. They allowed themselves to rest when the earth allowed it. And in that, they never saw themselves as fragile. This resilience is part of the secret. Today, we're taught that without the right mattress, the right pillow, the right room temperature, we can't function. But the Vikings knew a different truth. The body is adaptable. With rhythm, with intention, with respect, it can learn to rest anywhere. Even on the deck of a ship slicing through mist, even beneath the northern stars with nothing but fire and furs. Silence in the modern world is rare. Even at night, it's broken by the low hum of electronics, distant traffic, buzzing appliances. We have grown used to a low-grade noise that never really leaves us, even in sleep. But the people of Viking times knew a different kind of silence, a true silence, one that wasn't empty, but full of presence, of peace, of stillness. In the longhouse, once the stories were told and the fire had settled into embers, silence took over not as an absence, but as a blanket. It was thick, grounding, alive. You could hear your own breath, the shifting of someone turning beneath fur, a dog's soft exhale, the creak of wood cooling in the night. That was it. No machines, no city pulse, no glowing distractions. And it was in this silence that sleep found its deepest roots. Silence in Viking culture wasn't feared, it was respected. There was a time to speak, a time to sing, and a time to let the night speak for itself. After a long day of labour, or sailing, or tending animals, the silence was not awkward, it was sacred. It allowed thoughts to drift, hearts to soften, bodies to relax. In this quiet, people processed their lives. They prayed, they dreamed, they listened to the night, to themselves, to the sound of the wind moving through the trees. It was a silence that didn't ask for anything. It simply held you. Today, sleep studies confirm what the Vikings understood intuitively, that true silence supports deeper sleep, that even low-frequency noise barely audible can disturb the body's natural rhythm, pulling it from its rest without us even knowing. Our ears remain alert, our brains half awake. But the Vikings, surrounded by the natural hush of wilderness and stone, slept without interruption. When noise did come, it meant something. A stirring animal, a gust of wind, a knock at the door. The quiet made such sounds meaningful. This is why their rest ran so deep, not only because of the way they lived, but because of the space they allowed around that living. A space without constant input, without stimulation, without the expectation to fill every moment with sound. And in that quiet, their nervous systems relaxed, their minds let go, their breath slowed. There was nothing more to take in, only darkness, warmth, and the slow beat of the fire beside them. We underestimate silence today. We try to replace it with calming music, or sleep podcasts, or guided meditations. But the people of Viking times didn't need to be guided toward rest. They simply allowed it to arrive. Silence wasn't a tool. It was the nature of night. And in that silence, without needing to be entertained, distracted, or numbed, they fell asleep. Not because they had to, but because there was nothing pulling them away from it. To the modern world, night is often just a leftover what remains after the day's work is done. We squeeze in a few hours of distraction, then collapse, hoping for rest. But to the people of Viking times, the night was not an afterthought, it was sacred. It held its own weight, its own mood, its own rhythm. It was not just the absence of light, it was the presence of something deeper. In the Viking worldview, day was for labour, for trade, travel, tending, training. But night That was the time for things that couldn't happen in sunlight. The telling of stories, the passing down of memory, the tending of inner life. It was not a time of productivity. It was a time of presence. In the longhouse, once the work was done and the fire was stoked, families sat close, wrapped in wool and shadow. This wasn't idle time, it was connective time. Parents told children tales of gods and monsters, of journeys made and battles won. Elders recited sagas from memory. Quiet conversations drifted across the fire. Eyes softened, hands stilled. Breath fell into rhythm. It was in these moments, before first sleep, that the mind began to shift, to slow, to settle. And so, by the time people lay down, their bodies weren't fighting the night. They had been walking toward it for hours. There were no harsh transitions, no blue light jolting the eyes, no abrupt silencing of thought by exhaustion. There was a gradual descent, a letting go. Night was a corridor, not a cliff. And the Vikings walked it with care. Even spiritually, the night was a threshold. In Norse belief, the veil between worlds was thinner in darkness. Ancestors might visit in dreams. The gods might whisper in symbols, in visions. Night was not just a time to shut off, it was a time to open. Rituals sometimes marked this sacredness. Simple offerings left at doorways, prayers to household spirits, a quiet word to the departed. These weren't dramatic acts, they were woven into the quiet itself. And then came sleep, not with resistance, not with guilt, but with surrender, because the night had already prepared them. Today, we rush into sleep without honouring what comes before it. We carry the heat of our screens, the noise of our worries, the bright pulse of our timelines into the very moment we close our eyes. And we wonder why we can't fall. The Vikings didn't wonder, they knew. Night was not a problem to solve. It was a gift to receive, a time to step outside of urgency and into stillness, a time for restoration, not just of the body, but of the soul. In the sacred quiet of the night, they found not just sleep, they found themselves. In the Viking longhouse, children were never far from the fire or from the arms that held them. They slept where the warmth was, nestled beside parents or siblings, wrapped in wool and fur, breathing in rhythm with the family. And their sleep, unlike the troubled rest of so many modern children, was deep, safe, and full. There were no separate rooms, no night lights, no bedtime battles. Sleep was not enforced, it simply happened. When the day ended, when chores were done, stories told, firelight low children, like adults, slowed. They weren't overstimulated. They weren't pulled between glowing screens or wound tight with schedules. They lived by the sun, and their bodies knew what to do when it set. A child might fall asleep on a parent's lap, lulled by the murmur of conversation and the crackle of the hearth. No abrupt transition, no artificial silence. Just a slow descent into sleep, surrounded by familiar voices, the scent of wood smoke and wool, the quiet presence of others. There was no fear of the dark. The longhouse was dark by necessity, and darkness wasn't seen as something to be conquered. It was natural, expected, normal. Shadows moved along the beams, and the fire cast them in gentle rhythm. If a child stirred at night, they were not alone. A mother would be there, or a sibling, or the family dog. There were no monitors, no hovering anxiety, only presence. And when children woke in the middle of the night, between first and second sleep, it was not a crisis. It was accepted. A moment of wakefulness, a drink of water, a whispered word, and they would return to sleep easily. No pressure, no punishment. The rhythms of the household were built to support this. Sleep was communal, cyclical, in tune with biology, not in conflict with it. Modern parenting often isolates the child at night, under the belief that independence is best learned in solitude. But Viking parents knew that independence grew from connection, not separation. The closeness of sleep, of touch, of breath, of shared dreams gave children a deep-rooted sense of safety. From that safety, resilience grew. They didn't fear nightmares because they were never truly alone. And the wisdom passed down through generations wasn't written in books, it was whispered in the dark. In the still hours between sleeps, a father might murmur a line from a saga. A mother might hum a lullaby, half remembered from her own childhood. These moments stitched childhood together with the fabric of culture. Today, we speak of sleep training, white noise, bedtime routines, but in Viking times, sleep wasn't trained, it was trusted. The sleep of children was not a task to complete. It was a rhythm to follow. And in the heart of the longhouse, they followed it every night, wrapped in fur, warmed by fire, and surrounded by love that did not end when the day did. That was the Viking child's rest. Simple, sacred, whole. Not everyone in the Viking world slept at the same time, and not everyone needed to. There was always someone who stayed awake just a little longer. Not by command or obligation, but by rhythm, by role. The sleepless watcher wasn't always the strongest or youngest, but they were always present, listening, guarding, holding the night while others rested. In many households, this might be an elder someone whose body no longer demanded long stretches of sleep, who had learned over the years how to move through the dark without waking the house. Or it might be the head of the family, rising after first sleep to check the fire, whisper a prayer, or sharpen a blade by firelight. It wasn't dramatic. There was no pacing, no tension, just quiet movement, quiet breath, a presence that made the longhouse feel protected. The watcher might sit near the hearth, wrapped in wool, sipping warm ale or chewing dried herbs. They listened to the house itself, the soft breathing of the children, the shifting of straw, the pop and hiss of coals settling into ash. They weren't waiting for anything. They were simply there. This role was never formalized, but everyone knew it mattered. When the world was dark and full of unknowns, wild animals, storms, other men, someone awake meant safety. It meant that if danger did come, it would not arrive unnoticed. It meant that the household, though resting, was not unguarded. Today, we try to replicate this feeling of safety with security systems and motion sensors. But in Viking times, it came from something older trust in the living presence of someone near. And this presence had more than one purpose. The watcher held the fire. Fire was life, and if it went out, so did the warmth, the light, the protection from the night. Tending it was not a chore, it was an offering. A quiet act of devotion to the household and the gods who watched over it. Sometimes the watcher would think, sometimes they would remember. In that deep, uninterrupted dark, the mind had space to unfold. There was no noise to fill it, no task to distract it, just the kind of thought that comes only in stillness. And when the time felt right, when the fire was fed, the wind had settled, and the breath of the longhouse remained steady, they would return to their bedding. No announcement, no applause. Just a slow descent into second sleep, knowing the house had been held for a little while longer. The watcher slept differently, not less, not poorly, just with a different rhythm, a different role. Because even in the heart of rest, someone had to carry the quiet. And in doing so, they became part of the secret, the invisible thread that made Viking sleep not just personal, but communal. Not just silent, but safe. Not everyone in the Viking world slept at the same time, and not everyone needed to. There was always someone who stayed awake just a little longer. Not by command or obligation, but by rhythm, by role. The sleepless watcher wasn't always the strongest or youngest, but they were always present, listening, guarding, holding the night while others rested. In many households, this might be an elder someone whose body no longer demanded long stretches of sleep, who had learned over the years how to move through the dark without waking the house. Or it might be the head of the family, rising after first sleep to check the fire, whisper a prayer, or sharpen a blade by firelight. It wasn't dramatic. There was no pacing, no tension, just quiet movement, quiet breath. A presence that made the longhouse feel protected. The watcher might sit near the hearth, wrapped in wool, sipping warm ale or chewing dried herbs. They listened to the house itself, the soft breathing of the children, the shifting of straw, the pop and hiss of coals settling into ash. They weren't waiting for anything. They were simply there. This role was never formalized, but everyone knew it mattered. When the world was dark and full of unknowns, wild animals, storms, other men, someone awake meant safety. It meant that if danger did come, it would not arrive unnoticed. It meant that the household, though resting, was not unguarded. Today, we try to replicate this feeling of safety with security systems and motion sensors. But in Viking times, it came from something older trust in the living presence of someone near. And this presence had more than one purpose. The watcher held the fire. Fire was life, and if it went out, so did the warmth, the light, the protection from the night. Tending it was not a chore, it was an offering. A quiet act of devotion to the household and the gods who watched over it. Sometimes the watcher would think. Sometimes they would remember. In that deep, uninterrupted dark, the mind had space to unfold. There was no noise to fill it, no task to distract it. Just the kind of thought that comes only in stillness. And when the time felt right, when the fire was fed, the wind had settled, and the breath of the longhouse remained steady, they would return to their bedding. No announcement, no applause. Just a slow descent into second sleep, knowing the house had been held for a little while longer. The watcher slept differently, not less, not poorly, just with a different rhythm, a different role. Because even in the heart of rest, someone had to carry the quiet. And in doing so, they became part of the secret, the invisible thread that made Viking sleep not just personal, but communal. Not just silent, but safe. In Viking times, the morning did not begin with an alarm. There were no shrill tones to rip the body from sleep, no glowing digits blinking 6 a.m. with urgency. There was only the light, the cold, and the quiet rhythm of waking that matched the world outside. They rose slowly often with the earth itself. As dawn crept in through the smoke hole or around the edges of the door, the longhouse stirred like a single sleeping body. One person shifted beneath the furs. Another stretched, slowly, then sat up, their breath visible in the cold. No one rushed, no one jolted. Waking was part of the sleep cycle, not its interruption. The fire, long banked to embers, would be stirred back to life. A warm drink broth, ale, or water from a clay jug might be passed around. Children would blink awake, not with resistance, but with the softness of those who had slept near the people they trusted most. And the first sounds of the day weren't commands or noise, they were murmurs. The creak of wood, a soft greeting, the scratching of wool being pulled over a shoulder. There was no need to get a jump on the day. The day would come, and the people of Viking times, rested and aligned with its pace, would be ready for it. This natural waking is something we've almost forgotten. Today, we shock ourselves out of sleep with noise, with light, with urgency. We measure productivity in minutes after rising, drink stimulants to erase the fog. But the Vikings did not wake from battle. They woke from peace. Even in seasons when the sun came late, when the sky stayed dark well into morning, they relied not on clocks, but on rhythm, the rhythm of animals, of temperature, of time spent asleep, known in the body like the feel of breath. Waking wasn't a reset, it was a continuation, and in this way, sleep was not a state to escape from, but a place to rise from gently like standing from a stream, carrying the stillness with you. What we often miss in modern life is that the quality of waking shapes the quality of the day. And in the Viking world, waking was treated with the same quiet reverence as sleep itself. Not rushed, not resented. Just part of the cycle. As light returned to the sky and footsteps moved toward the door, life resumed, but it resumed from rest, from depth, from real sleep. And that, too, was part of the secret. Not just how the Vikings slept, but how they returned from it. Not startled, but whole. We talk about sleep today as if it's broken something we must fix, optimize, hack. But the people of Viking times would not have understood this. To them, sleep was not something to control. It was something to follow, like the wind, like the stars, like the cycle of life itself. They didn't sleep perfectly because they tried harder. They slept perfectly because they didn't try at all. They let the world shape them. Darkness signaled the body to slow. Firelight soothed the mind. First sleep gave way to waking, and waking returned naturally to rest. Everything unfolded in rhythm. No one tracked sleep cycles. No one worried about REM. And yet, they rose in the morning strong, alert, ready because their sleep was honest. It wasn't stolen between deadlines or numbed by blue screens. It was real, and it was shared. Today, we struggle to rest in a world that never truly stops. Our bedrooms glow like office spaces. Our minds race long after the sun goes down. We've built a culture that rewards output and resents rest. But the Viking world was different. They trusted the night. They trusted the body. They knew that sleep is not something to dominate, but something to return to, like a home. And now, perhaps, we're beginning to remember. Sleep scientists rediscover what old ways once knew. That two-phase sleep is natural. That firelight helps the brain rest. That silence is sacred. That waking at midnight is not a problem, it's a pattern. That closeness brings calm, that the body, if allowed, will find its way back. The secret to perfect sleep wasn't buried. It was lived every night, beside the hearth, beneath the stars, in a longhouse that breathed with the rhythm of the earth. And it is still there, in every quiet hour before bed, in every step away from the screen, in every flicker of candlelight, in the decision to listen instead of scroll, to sit with stillness instead of fighting it. The people of Viking times did not invent perfect sleep. They simply remembered how to keep it. And so can we, because deep inside us, the body still remembers the old ways. The breath still slows with firelight. The muscles still trust the warmth of furs. The mind still softens when surrounded by silence. The secret to perfect sleep was never really lost. It's just waiting for us to stop forgetting.